If the CEO of a major restaurant chain walks into one of his stores and discovers corruption right under his nose, a ruthless manager exploits employees' wages are stolen. But what he discovers next goes all the way to the top. This is not just a fight for justice. It is a fight to take back an entire company. And it all starts with a visit, an overheard conversation, and a decision that will change everything before we even begin. Let us know what time you are listening to this and where you are. Leave a comment below. We would love to hear from you. Jonathan Hart's black leather shoes clicked sharply against the cold marble floor of the fast food restaurant. He adjusted his jacket as he glanced around, keeping his demeanor casual, though his heart was racing. Today was no ordinary visit. Today, he wasn't the CEO of Hart's Burgers. He was just another customer. "Can I get extra fries this time, Dad?" Lily, his 10-year-old daughter, tugged at his sleeve. Her voice was light, innocent. Jonathan smiled, ruffling her hair. "We'll see if they're any good, kiddo," he replied with a chuckle, trying to keep his tone normal. But his mind was already elsewhere, focused on the employees around him. They walked past the entrance, the familiar red and gold signs hanging overhead. But the atmosphere inside felt different today. The usual rush of lunchtime customers was present, but there was something in the air, a tension that stuck like a layer of dust, thick and uncomfortable. Jonathan had been to countless restaurants before, both his own and others, and he knew this feeling all too well. The staff was moving in quick, mechanical motions, but it wasn't the usual flow of a bustling restaurant. There were no jokes, no banter between coworkers. It felt stiff, like everyone was holding their breath. The energy was off. Jonathan took a deep breath, glancing at Lily. She seemed oblivious, happily bouncing from table to table, but Jonathan's gaze stayed sharp. His eyes scanned the counter, the kitchen, the fry station. "Everything okay, Dad?" Lily asked, tugging at his sleeve once again. Jonathan blinked, snapping out of his thoughts. Yeah, just a little tired. Let's grab a table." They sat down at one of the booths, and Jonathan's eyes continued to roam, his instincts pushing him to dig deeper. Something wasn't right. He could see it in the way the employees moved, the lack of interaction, the forced smiles. But it was the cashier, Sarah, that really caught his attention. She looked young, maybe in her 20s, her name tag barely visible against the worn apron. She gave him a tight smile when they approached the counter. "Welcome to Hart's Burgers. What can I get for you today?" Her voice was polite, but there was something unnatural about it, like she had practiced this line 1,000 times, but it never felt real. Her smile never quite reached her eyes, and Jonathan felt a pang of discomfort. He ordered their meals casually, trying to keep his tone light. "Fries have been good lately," he added, hoping to start a simple conversation. Sarah hesitated before nodding. "Yes, sir, fries are good today," she replied, her voice strained. Jonathan picked up on it immediately. The uncertainty in her voice, the stiffness in her movements, the way she seemed to hold her breath as she punched in their order. It was all wrong. "Thanks," Jonathan said, forcing a smile of his own before heading to a nearby booth with Lily. But his thoughts raced. Something about Sarah's unease, the way she had responded, he couldn't shake it. Jonathan tried to relax, took a bite of his burger, but his mind kept drifting back to the cashier. He watched her, carefully, almost too carefully. He noticed how her hands shook slightly as she handed over the receipt, her fingers hovering over the register keys for just a moment too long, like she was scared of making a mistake. Jonathan leaned back in his seat, his gaze still on her. "Dad, I'm bored," Lily's voice broke through his thoughts. Jonathan smiled at her, but his mind was elsewhere. "I'll be right back," he said, excusing himself. He walked toward the restrooms, but his steps didn't lead him to the bathroom. He kept walking, veering off toward the employee area at the back of the restaurant. His curiosity gnawed at him, pushing him forward. As he neared the break room, he heard it, the sharp sound of a voice, raised and cutting through the quiet hum of the kitchen. Jonathan stopped in his tracks, his heart rate picking up. "You think you matter here? Look at yourself!" The voice was condescending, mocking. It was a tone Jonathan knew all too well, one of authority abused. He remained where he was, pressing himself against the cool wall outside the break room, straining to hear every word. The conversation continued, and Jonathan's fists clenched. I could replace you by tomorrow, you know that, right? You either step up or step out, the voice barked. The silence that followed was suffocating. Jonathan's jaw tightened. He recognized that voice. Mark Dawson, the manager of this location. Jonathan had heard rumors about him, but this was something else. He'd seen managers abuse their power before, but this was different. Jonathan stood still, his pulse quickening as he listened, his mind processing what he had just heard. He was no stranger to leadership, to managing power. But hearing Mark's words, Jonathan understood that this wasn't about business efficiency or customer service. It was about control, intimidation, fear. Then he heard a softer voice, almost a whisper. It was Sarah. I'm doing my best, she said, her voice tight with emotion. Jonathan's stomach churned. His eyes narrowed as he leaned in closer, every word from the break room cutting through him like a blade. Your best isn't enough. It never is. If you keep making mistakes, I'll cut your shifts, Mark snapped. The words rang in Jonathan's ears as he stood frozen in place. Cutting shifts, humiliating employees. He had heard it before. The power imbalance, the manipulation. But this time, it was different. He had heard it, and he couldn't ignore it. He needed to know more. He needed to confront Mark. But first, he had to understand how deep this went. He stepped away from the break room and made his way back to the dining area. Lily was sitting quietly, already halfway through her fries. Jonathan's eyes scanned the room, catching sight of Sarah behind the counter again. She moved quickly, efficiently, but her shoulders were tense, her hands trembling slightly. Mark stood nearby, watching like a hawk, scanning the restaurant floor. The fear was palpable, the control evident in every glance Mark cast over his staff. Jonathan's appetite had disappeared. The burger in front of him felt like sawdust in his mouth. He couldn't stop watching. Watching Mark, watching Sarah, watching the fear ripple through the staff like a silent, invisible current. Then, it happened. Jonathan watched as Mark stepped behind the register, checking something in the drawer. It was subtle, too subtle, but Jonathan caught it. Mark reached in, pulled out a few bills, and tucked them into his palm before casually closing the register. Jonathan's stomach dropped. The theft was happening right in front of him, and no one was saying a word. He sat there, pretending to eat, but his mind was racing. Mark wasn't just a bad manager. He was stealing. Jonathan could feel the weight of it pressing down on him. This wasn't just a small issue. This was systemic. It was deliberate. Jonathan knew he had to confront Mark, but he also knew he had to be careful. If he acted too quickly, Mark could cover his tracks, destroy any evidence. No, Jonathan needed to wait. He needed to get more proof. For now, all he could do was watch, wait, plan. The room buzzed around him, but Jonathan's thoughts were a storm. This wasn't just about a bad day in the restaurant. This was about something much bigger. And Jonathan Hart wasn't going to let it slide. Not now, not ever. Jonathan stayed seated, pretending to nibble at his food while his mind raced. His eyes never left the counter where Sarah stood. He kept thinking about the heated conversation he'd overheard in the break room, the threats from Mark, the shaky response from Sarah. It all pointed to something dark and wrong. Sarah was still at the register, scanning orders, her movements too quick and too mechanical. Jonathan could see the strain in her shoulders. Her eyes darted nervously around the restaurant, avoiding any direct eye contact with Mark, who loitered near the back of the kitchen, watching everyone like a hawk. Jonathan's hand tightened around his soda cup, his gaze following Mark as he paced the kitchen. Every time Mark stepped forward, the employees stiffened, their faces falling. No one dared to speak. No one dared to make a mistake. Jonathan could feel the oppressive atmosphere hanging over the entire restaurant. His attention flickered back to Sarah. She was busy, but her hands seemed too unsteady as she handed over receipts to customers. Jonathan saw her take in a deep breath, exhaling as she passed another receipt to a customer. It looked like she was bracing herself for the next interaction. Suddenly, she dropped a stack of napkins, and a soft clattering sound rang in the air. Mark whipped around, his eyes narrowing as he stomped toward her. Jonathan's breath caught in his chest. He watched as Sarah hastily bent down to pick them up, muttering an apology under her breath. Mark didn't yell this time. No, his gaze alone was enough to send a chill down Sarah's spine. "Careful next time," Mark spat, His voice was low, but the venom in it was clear. Jonathan could see Sarah flinch, her face turning pale as she nodded silently. His heart clenched in anger. He had seen enough. This wasn't just bad management. This was abuse, plain and simple. But it wasn't just the bullying. Jonathan was starting to piece things together. Mark's behavior, the tension, the silent compliance from the employees. It wasn't just a bad boss. Something was wrong with the whole system. Jonathan's thoughts flashed back to what he had overheard earlier. Mark had been threatening to cut Sarah's shifts, using fear to control her. But it was more than that, something deeper. And now Jonathan was convinced. Mark wasn't just a bad manager, he was a thief. Jonathan stood up, pushing his plate away. He walked toward the counter, careful not to draw attention to himself. As he neared the register, he saw Mark step away from Sarah, heading toward the office. Jonathan didn't waste any time. He quickly moved behind the counter, finding a moment when no one was looking. He peered over the edge of the register drawer. There it was, a few bills, just enough to be missed in the daily rush. Mark had pocketed them as if it was part of his routine. Jonathan's blood ran cold. This wasn't an accident. This was deliberate. Mark had been stealing from the restaurant, and he'd been doing it for a while. Jonathan's mind spun, processing what he'd just seen. This wasn't just a rogue manager taking advantage of a vulnerable employee. This was systematic theft, and it went all the way to the top. Jonathan clenched his fists as he stepped back. He had to act, but not right now. He needed more. He needed proof. If he confronted Mark now, the man would just cover his tracks, lie, and probably get away with it. No, Jonathan had to wait. He needed to watch, gather more evidence. There was something much larger at play here, and Jonathan Hart wasn't about to let it slip through his fingers. He headed back to his seat, trying to calm his racing thoughts. His appetite was gone, replaced with a burning desire to get to the bottom of this. Sarah, Mark, the stolen cash, it was all a piece of the puzzle. But Jonathan wasn't sure how deep this went. Lily was still happily eating her fries, completely unaware of the tension that had built up in the room. Jonathan tried to shake the unease from his shoulders, but it clung to him like a shadow. He couldn't stop thinking about Sarah, about the fear in her eyes, about the system of control and theft that was silently suffocating this place. "Dad, you okay?" Lily's voice pulled him from his thoughts. Jonathan forced a smile, but inside his mind was already working through his next steps. "Yeah, kiddo, I'm good. Let's finish up." But his gaze never left the employees. He kept watching, taking in every small movement, every glance that flicked nervously toward Mark, every hint of unease. It was all leading him somewhere dark. He could feel it. Jonathan didn't waste any time. He'd seen enough. The evidence was clear. Mark was abusing his position, stealing from the company, and bullying the staff into submission. But Jonathan knew he couldn't take Mark on alone. He had to be strategic. He had to expose everything, all at once. With a steady breath, Jonathan stood up and walked over to the kitchen area. He passed by Sarah, who was still trying to force a smile, but this time Jonathan made sure to make eye contact. She looked away quickly, her shoulders tensing, and Jonathan could tell she was still terrified of what Mark might do if she spoke up. But he couldn't let that stop him. He glanced over at Mark. The man was standing by the back office, his arms crossed, surveying the room like a predator waiting for its prey. Jonathan could feel the tension building as he took a few steps closer. "Mark!" Jonathan's voice was calm but firm as he approached the man. Mark turned, his usual smug smile fading as he recognized Jonathan. "What's going on here?" Jonathan asked, his voice steady. He wasn't going to back down. Mark scoffed, rolling his eyes. "What's going on? I'm just trying to run my restaurant. Not sure why you're making a fuss about it." He tried to brush Jonathan off, but there was an edge in his voice now, a hint of defensiveness. "I'm not making a fuss. I'm asking about what's going on behind the counter," Jonathan said, keeping his tone even. "I've been watching. I've seen the way you talk to your staff, the way you treat them. It's not right." Mark's face hardened. "You don't know anything about running this place, Hart," he sneered. "You think you can just come in here and change everything? This is my restaurant now." Jonathan stood firm, his eyes narrowing. "This isn't your restaurant, Mark. This is the employees' restaurant. You've been using your position to intimidate them, bully them, and steal from the company." The words hit Mark like a slap in the face. His eyes flashed with anger, but Jonathan didn't back down. "I saw you take cash from the register. Jonathan continued. "I heard you threaten Sarah, and I've been watching. You've been taking advantage of your power here for far too long." Mark's jaw clenched, and for a moment Jonathan saw something shift in his eyes. Fear, maybe, or guilt, but it was only for a split second before Mark regained his composure. "You think you're better than me, don't you?" Mark spat, his voice low and dangerous. "You think I'm the problem here? You're just like every other CEO who thinks he can swoop in and fix things with a snap of his fingers. You have no idea what it's like to be in charge." Jonathan didn't flinch. "I know what it's like to take responsibility," he said, his voice cutting through Mark's defensiveness. "And I'm not about to let you destroy everything for your own gain." Mark's hands clenched into fists at his sides. For a moment, Jonathan thought Mark might lash out, but instead, the man let out a long, slow breath. "This isn't over," Mark muttered, his voice low, but his eyes were filled with a mix of rage and fear. "You think you can just come in here and change everything? You have no idea what you're up against." Jonathan stood his ground. "I'm not backing down, Mark. You're done here." Mark's smirk faded, and for a brief moment Jonathan saw the mask crack. The man was cornered, and he knew it. Jonathan could feel the weight of the moment. The confrontation was just beginning. But Jonathan had to be careful. He couldn't let Mark slip away. Couldn't let him cover his tracks. This was bigger than just one bad manager. It was a system that needed to be torn down. And Jonathan knew that, no matter how hard it would be, he was going to see this through to the end. He turned to walk away, but Mark's voice stopped him. "You think you've won?" Mark called after him. "You haven't seen anything yet." Jonathan paused, turning back to face Mark. His expression was calm, resolute. "I've seen enough, Mark. The game's over." With those final words, Jonathan left Mark standing there, his fists clenched, the weight of his words hanging in the air. The battle was far from over, but Jonathan had made his move. Now, the real fight began. Jonathan spent the next few days quietly watching, gathering evidence. He knew the confrontation with Mark was just the first step. There were layers to this, layers he needed to peel back. His mind kept returning to the conversation he'd overheard, to the stolen cash, and to the employees who were too afraid to speak out. It was time to dig deeper. Jonathan called in Sarah for a quiet conversation away from the prying eyes of the restaurant. He found her wiping down the counter, her hands moving quickly, but there was a sense of exhaustion in the way she did it, almost like a ritual she had come to accept. She didn't look up when he approached. "Sarah," Jonathan said softly, his voice gentle, "can we talk for a minute?" She stiffened, her eyes darting around nervously. She clearly didn't want anyone to hear what was coming. After a few seconds, she hesitated, then nodded, leading him to the storage room in the back, a quieter space where no one could overhear them. As soon as the door shut behind them, Sarah's shoulders slumped, the weight of her fears crashing down on her. "What do you want from me?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "I want the truth, Sarah," Jonathan said, his tone firm but compassionate. "I know about the threats. I saw what happened with Mark. I know you're scared, but I need to know what's really going on here." She swallowed, her eyes flickering with a mix of fear and reluctance. For a moment she said nothing. Then her voice cracked. "Mark, he's not the only one. He's been stealing. The money, the payroll, he's been taking it for months. And no one does anything. He has the power to make people disappear if they try to speak up." Jonathan's heart sank. The confirmation was worse than he had feared. The corruption wasn't just isolated to Mark. It was part of something much bigger. "How long has this been going on?" Jonathan pressed. Sarah's eyes flickered with a mixture of sadness and resignation. "Before I got here, too. I've heard whispers. People tried to report it, but they were fired. Or they left because of the pressure. I didn't want to end up like them." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "You're not alone in this, Sarah. I'm not going to let them intimidate you anymore, but I need more. I need to know who's protecting him, who's letting this happen." She looked up, a flicker of hope in her eyes. "I think it's Carl, the regional director. He's been backing Mark all along. Every time someone tried to report Mark, it disappeared. Carl's the one pulling the strings. But it's not just him. There's a whole network of them." Jonathan felt the pieces falling into place. Carl, the regional director, Jonathan had heard rumors about him, but this was the confirmation he needed. Carl wasn't just an innocent bystander. He was part of the web, and the web stretched far beyond the restaurant. I've seen Carl cover for Mark before, Sarah continued, her voice trembling. He's the one who made sure nothing ever got past him. No one ever had the guts to go higher because they knew what would happen. Jonathan's eyes hardened. They're not going to get away with this anymore. You're going to be safe, Sarah. I'm going to make sure of it. He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. But I need your help. You have to be ready to stand up to this, to expose it all. Together, we can take them down. For the first time, Sarah seemed to believe it. A flicker of courage sparked in her eyes. She nodded, though her expression remained cautious. I'll do whatever I can, she whispered, her voice filled with a quiet resolve. Jonathan gave her a reassuring nod. Thank you. We'll get through this, together. As Sarah returned to the counter, Jonathan stood there for a moment longer, his mind racing. Carl was next. He had to expose him, but Jonathan knew it wouldn't be easy. There were too many people involved, too many that had been complicit in the corruption. But he had no choice now. He was already too deep into this to turn back. The following week, Jonathan put his plan into motion. He knew that confronting Carl directly wouldn't be enough. Mark was just a small cog in the larger machine. The real battle was at the top. Carl had been running this show for far too long, and Jonathan wasn't about to let it continue. It was time for the confrontation. Jonathan arranged a meeting with Carl under the pretense of discussing company performance and operational issues. The time had come for the real showdown. He couldn't let Carl slip away. This was the moment to expose everything. Mark's theft, Carl's manipulation, and the broken system that allowed it all to happen. Jonathan sat in the conference room, his palms sweating slightly as he waited. He had the evidence, financial records, witness testimonies, and Sarah's statements. Carl wouldn't be able to lie his way out of this one, but Jonathan knew Carl would try. The door opened, and Carl walked in with his usual cocky swagger. He didn't even bother with pleasantries. Yediji just took a seat across from Jonathan, his gaze narrowing. Jonathan, Carl said, his voice dripping with condescension, I'm surprised you wanted to meet in person. Is there a problem? Jonathan met Carl's gaze without flinching. There's a huge problem, Carl, and I'm done pretending it doesn't exist. Carl leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing at the corner of his mouth. Oh? And what exactly is the problem, Jonathan? Jonathan didn't hesitate. He slammed a stack of papers onto the table, the sound echoing through the room. You've been running a corrupt operation. You've been protecting Mark. You've been stealing from the company, manipulating the numbers, and using your power to intimidate employees into silence. Carl's smirk faltered for just a moment, but he quickly recovered. You don't have any proof of that, he said, trying to sound confident, but Jonathan could hear the slight tremor in his voice. Don't I? Jonathan said, his voice steady. You're going to want to take a look at these. He flipped through the papers, showing Carl the financial discrepancies, the payroll manipulation, the missing cash from the registers. This is just the tip of the iceberg, Carl. I've been watching, and I've seen enough. Carl's face darkened, but he didn't speak for a long moment. Instead, he folded his arms and stared at Jonathan, his expression one of defiance. You think you can just come in here and ruin everything I've built? Carl finally said, his voice low and dangerous. You don't understand how this works. You're in over your head. Jonathan leaned forward, his eyes piercing. You're the one who's over your head, Carl, and it's time for you to face the consequences. You're done. Carl's eyes flickered with anger, but he quickly masked it. You think you've won, Jonathan? You think taking down Mark is going to solve anything? You have no idea what you're dealing with. I know exactly what I'm dealing with, Jonathan said, his voice cold. This is bigger than Mark, and it's bigger than you. You're part of a system of exploitation and theft, Carl, and I'm going to expose it all. For a moment, Carl said nothing. His fingers drummed impatiently on the arm of his chair, but Jonathan could see the fear creeping into his eyes. He was cornered, and he knew it. You're finished here, Jonathan said firmly, his voice leaving no room for doubt. Carl stood up abruptly, his fists clenched. This isn't over, he spat before storming out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Jonathan remained seated for a moment, his chest heaving with the weight of the confrontation. He had taken the first step, but he knew this was just the beginning. Carl might have left the room, but the real battle was just beginning. There were more people involved in this corrupt system, and Jonathan was going to take them all down. He stood up, determination flooding through him. It was time to finish what he had started. Jonathan sat in his car, eyes fixed on the glow of his phone screen. He had spent hours compiling evidence, cross-referencing financial reports, employee statements, and Sarah's testimony. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and he knew he was on the verge of something big. The media conference was scheduled for the next morning, and Jonathan had been preparing for weeks. He had already informed key employees, Sarah, Alex, and a few former staff members, who had been brave enough to come forward. Today, everything was going to change. As he sat in the parking lot of the restaurant, his mind raced with the final pieces of the plan. This wasn't just about exposing Mark or Carl. This was about tearing down the entire system of exploitation and fear that had infected Hartzberger's from the top down. It was about giving the employees their voices back and showing the public what had been happening behind closed doors. When the conference room filled with reporters the next morning, Jonathan stood at the front, facing a sea of curious eyes and flashing cameras. He could feel the weight of the moment, but there was no hesitation. This was his time to speak the truth. As the room settled, Jonathan took a deep breath and began. "Thank you for being here today," he said, his voice steady but firm. "I'm here to talk about a culture of corruption that has been running through this company for years. It wasn't just one bad manager. It wasn't just a few misplaced funds. It was a system that abused employees, stole from the company, and was protected by those who should have been ensuring its success." He paused, letting the words sink in. The reporters shifted in their seats, scribbling down notes. "I know this is going to be hard to hear, but I need you to understand that what has been happening here is a reality for far too many of our staff. We've had managers like Mark Dawson who have been exploiting employees, threatening their livelihoods, and even stealing from the register. But Mark isn't working alone, and that's what I'm here to expose." Jonathan gestured to a table behind him where stacks of papers sat. The room fell silent as the first few pages were projected onto the screen behind him. Financial records, stolen payroll data, and witness testimonies. "The first thing I want to show you is the evidence of what's been happening. These are records of payroll manipulations, stolen wages, and unreported cash transactions. And these aren't isolated incidents. They've been happening across multiple locations, under the watchful eye of Carl Stevens, the regional director who protected this behavior. He covered up the theft and intimidated anyone who tried to report it." Jonathan's voice didn't shake as he continued. "But it's not just Carl. There's a network of people higher up who have allowed this to happen, and that's what I'm going to tear down." The reporters exchanged glances, murmuring among themselves. Jonathan turned to Sarah, Alex, and a few other former employees, giving them a nod. One by one, they stepped forward, their testimonies filling the room. Sarah spoke about the threats she had received from Mark. Alex recounted the manipulation of payroll, and Daniel, a former assistant manager, explained how he had been fired after he tried to report the fraud. Each story added weight to the case Jonathan was building. And as the final testimony was shared, Jonathan felt the tide turning. The public was beginning to see the truth. The employees, once silenced by fear, were now speaking out, their voices powerful and clear. But then, just as Jonathan thought he was gaining control, a voice cut through the tension. It was Carl. "Lies!" Carl barked, stepping into the room with his usual arrogance. He tried to maintain his composure, but his eyes were filled with rage. "All of this is lies. Jonathan Hart has been trying to destroy everything we've worked for. He's just upset because things weren't going the way he wanted. This is a power struggle, nothing more." Jonathan didn't flinch. "I'm not here to fight for power, Carl. I'm here to fight for the truth. And the truth is you've been stealing. You've been abusing your position, and you've been complicit in this system of corruption." Carl's face turned red with anger. "You don't know what you're talking about." "I know exactly what I'm talking about," Jonathan retorted. "You've been manipulating the numbers, hiding evidence, and firing anyone who got too close. You thought no one would notice. But you were wrong." The reporters were already furiously typing, their cameras flashing. The shift was unmistakable. Carl had lost control of the narrative. "Mark Dawson is no longer with this company," Jonathan continued, his voice resolute, "and Carl Stevens has been removed from his position. But this is just the beginning. We are going to conduct a full internal investigation, and no one is above the law." With that, the conference ended. But Jonathan knew that this was far from over. The war wasn't won with one press conference, but today they had taken the first step. As the days passed, the atmosphere at Hart's Burgers shifted. Employees who had once cowered under the weight of fear were starting to speak up, share their experiences, and demand change. But while the public victory was sweet, Jonathan knew it was just the beginning. He couldn't let Carl slip away so easily. There was someone else, someone much higher up, who had been pulling the strings all along. That person was Ronald Vickers, the senior vice president of operations, and Jonathan had no doubt that he had been protecting Carl for years. It was time to dig deeper. Jonathan began pulling strings behind the scenes, using his resources to dig into Ronald's past. What he uncovered was worse than he expected. Ronald had been involved in several shady deals, signing off on financial discrepancies and redirecting funds to offshore accounts. Jonathan could feel the weight of the investigation growing heavier with every passing day. Late one night, Jonathan made the call. He reached out to his trusted ally, Margaret, who had been with the company for years and had always been loyal to the cause of integrity. She had long suspected that there was something more going on with Carl and Ronald, and now she was ready to help Jonathan take them down. "Margaret, we need to meet," Jonathan said, his voice low with urgency. "It's bigger than just Carl. There's a whole network of corruption we need to expose." "I knew it," Margaret replied, her tone sharp. "I've been waiting for you to realize that. It's not just Carl, it's Ronald, and it's even worse than we thought." Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. "I knew something was off, but I didn't realize just how deep it went. We have to act fast." Margaret's voice grew serious. "I've already started gathering evidence on Ronald. You're not the only one who's been suspicious." With Margaret's help, Jonathan began to uncover the full extent of the corruption at the highest levels of the company. The more they dug, the worse it became. Jonathan realized that he couldn't just take down Ronald on his own. He needed the full support of the board. And that would require a full investigation into every executive position, every financial record, and every shady deal that had been made. The fight was escalating, but Jonathan was ready. This wasn't just about taking down bad managers. It was about rebuilding the entire company from the ground up. The moment of reckoning came sooner than Jonathan expected. With the evidence in hand, Jonathan called an emergency board meeting. He knew that this would be his final chance to take down the corrupt executives and put an end to the system that had been strangling Hart's Burgers. As the board members filed into the room, Jonathan stood at the front, facing them with a calm resolve. He had spent days, weeks gathering proof, talking to whistleblowers, and uncovering the full extent of the corruption. And now it was time for the truth to come to light. The room was tense, filled with the heavy silence of unspoken questions and nervous glances. But Jonathan didn't flinch. "Today we face a reckoning," Jonathan began, his voice unwavering. "This company has been built on lies, on exploitation, and on corruption, and it's time to change that." He slammed a set of documents onto the table, the same evidence he had presented to the public. Payroll records, stolen funds, emails between Carl and Ronald, everything. "I have proof that Ronald Vickers has been protecting Carl Stevens, covering up the theft, and manipulating financial records to keep the money flowing to those at the top," Jonathan continued. "This isn't just a few rogue managers. This is systemic corruption." The board was silent, their faces a mix of shock and disbelief. But Jonathan didn't let up. He continued, detailing every transaction, every lie, every cover-up. "This isn't just about removing Carl and Ronald. This is about rebuilding this company from the ground up," Jonathan said, his voice strong. "We're going to put systems in place to ensure transparency, to ensure that employees have a voice, and to ensure that no one is ever above the law again." The room was still. But then, one by one, the board members began to nod in agreement. The decision was made. Ronald Vickers and Carl Stevens were fired, their contracts terminated effective immediately, and the investigation would continue. Jonathan walked out of the meeting room, his heart pounding. The battle wasn't over, but it had taken a significant step forward. As he stepped into the lobby, he saw Sarah and Alex waiting for him. They had been there through it all, supporting him, believing in the cause. "We did it," Jonathan said, his voice filled with a quiet satisfaction. "We're not done yet," Sarah replied with a smile, her confidence growing. "But we're on the right track." Jonathan smiled, his resolve stronger than ever. This was just the beginning. Hart's Burgers was going to be rebuilt, and it would be a place where integrity, respect, and fairness would define the future. The fight for the truth was just getting started, and Jonathan Hart was ready to see it through. As they walked out into the sunlight, Jonathan glanced over at his team, knowing that together they could face whatever came next.